The courtroom was quiet in a way only power could demand silence. Judge Elliot Grayson sat elevated behind the bench, spine straight, hands folded with practiced precision. The seal of the federal court loomed behind him like a halo carved from authority. Lawyers stood when he entered. Defendants avoided his eyes. To the public, he was stability itself, a man whose voice decided futures and whose reputation suggested incorruptibility. "Proceed," Grayson said calmly, and the room obeyed. From the outside, nothing about him suggested chaos. His hair was always neatly trimmed, his robes perfectly pressed. His rulings were cited in law reviews. Younger judges admired him. Older ones trusted him. He had built his career brick by brick, case by case, until his name alone carried weight. But beneath the robe, something was off. Grayson's fingers twitched once, a movement so small no one noticed. His eyes flicked briefly toward the gallery, not at the lawyers, not at the defendant, at an empty seat in the third row. It had been empty all morning, yet he kept looking at it, as if expecting someone to appear. The gavel struck. Another case concluded, another life redirected. When court recessed, Grayson retreated to his chambers, shutting the door with more force than necessary. The silence inside felt heavier than the one he'd commanded outside. He loosened his tie, exhaled sharply, and reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. The phone was there. He checked it the way some men check wounds. Quickly, fearfully. No new messages. Still, the screen showed a name he hadn't erased, couldn't erase. It burned brighter than the courtroom lights ever had. He set the phone face down, as if that could quiet it. Elliot Grayson had ruled on corruption cases. He had sentenced men who abused their power. He had lectured law students about ethics, about boundaries, about how justice demanded distance. And yet, every night, he crossed a line he pretended not to see. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself it wasn't what it looked like. He told himself he was in control. Control mattered to Grayson. It always had. Growing up in a house where anger arrived without warning, control had been his armor. Law gave him structure. The bench gave him certainty. And somewhere along the way, admiration turned into entitlement. The quiet belief that rules bent differently for men like him. He stared at the framed photos on his desk. His swearing-in ceremony, a handshake with Senator, a plaque for judicial excellence. Not a single personal photograph. No family. No reminders of a life outside the law. Except the phone. It vibrated once. Just once. Grayson's heart reacted faster than his reason. He flipped it over. Unknown contact. "Are we still meeting tonight?" His jaw tightened. He didn't reply. Not yet. He stood, straightened his robe again, and looked at his reflection in the glass cabinet. The man staring back looked composed, authoritative, a judge who decided truth. But behind that image lived another man entirely. A man who had made a promise he couldn't undo. A man whose private choices were inching dangerously close to the public record. Grayson turned off the light in his chambers and walked out, the echo of his footsteps following him down the empty hallway. Somewhere across the city, in a space far removed from polished wood and legal language, a woman was stretching her bruised feet against a studio wall, unaware that the man behind the bench was already shaping the trajectory of her life. The studio smelled of old wood, sweat, and resignation. Mara Vale pressed her palms flat against the wall, stretching her calves until a familiar burn reminded her she was still here. The mirror across the room reflected a version of her she barely recognized anymore. Lean from hunger, eyes shadowed by exhaustion, hair pulled back in a careless knot. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, indifferent to her effort. No one was watching. They never were. The music ended, leaving only the hum of the city bleeding through cracked windows. Mara stayed frozen in position for a few extra seconds, as if stopping meant admitting the truth. The rehearsal was over and nothing had changed. No callbacks, no contracts, just another night in an empty studio she could barely afford. She lowered herself to the floor, breathing hard. Dance had been her escape once, a language where pain became beautiful, where control lived in the body even when life offered none. But lately, it felt like performing into a void. Her phone buzzed. She hoped, briefly, foolishly, that it was good news. It wasn't. A reminder from the studio manager. Rent due tomorrow. Mara closed her eyes. She had grown used to disappointment, learned how to fold it neatly and keep moving. Still, some nights it pressed harder than others, especially when she thought about how visible she was on stage and how invisible she felt off it. She stood, grabbed her bag, and left the studio, locking the door behind her. Outside, the city was alive in ways she never felt part of. People hurried past with purpose, with somewhere to be. Mara walked without direction, letting her feet decide. That was how she ended up at the bar. It wasn't glamorous. Dim lighting, soft jazz bleeding from speakers, the kind of place people want to disappear for a while. She ordered the cheapest drink and sat alone, watching reflections ripple in the mirror behind the counter. "You dance," a voice said gently. She turned, startled. The man beside her hadn't been there a moment ago, or maybe he had, quietly, like someone used to observing without being noticed. He wore a tailored coat, his posture careful, composed. Not young, not old, just controlled. "I'm sorry," she asked. "Your ankles," he said, not looking at her now. "They're taped, and the way you hold yourself, it's trained." Mara hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I dance." He smiled faintly. "You look like someone who works very hard to be seen." Something about that sentence slipped past her defenses. They talked about art, about discipline, about disappointment, without ever using the word. He didn't flirt the way men usually did. He listened. When he spoke, it was with intention, as if every word had been weighed. He didn't tell her his name. She didn't ask. When she stood to leave, he said, "I'd like to see you perform sometime." Mara laughed softly. "You'd be the only one." "Then I consider myself lucky," he replied. Outside, the night air felt different, heavier, electric. She walked home replaying the conversation, unsettled by how much it had mattered, by how much she wanted it to. Later, alone in her apartment, she checked her phone. A new message waited. Unknown contact. "I hope you got home safe. E." Mara stared at the screen. She didn't know why her heart was racing. She didn't know who E really was. Only that, for the first time in a long while, someone had noticed her, not the dancer, but the woman. She typed back before she could overthink it. "I did. Thank you." Across the city, a man in a quiet apartment watched the screen light up and felt a boundary shift, subtle, almost imperceptible. Neither of them knew it yet, but the line they had just crossed would soon demand secrecy, rules, and a private room where nothing about them could remain innocent for long. The messages became routine before Mara realized they were rules. They arrived at measured intervals, never too late, never too familiar. Short check-ins, observations, invitations that sounded optional but never felt that way. "Dinner tomorrow. I can arrange a quiet place." Discretion matters. She told herself it was flattering that someone like him noticed details, respected boundaries. She told herself many things. Mostly, she told herself she was careful. Their first private meeting wasn't romantic. It was deliberate. A hotel off a side street, chosen not for luxury but anonymity. The lobby smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and old carpet. He arrived first, already seated, coat folded neatly beside him. When he stood to greet her, his smile was familiar now, restrained, reassuring. "You're nervous," he said, as if stating a fact. "So are you," she replied, surprising herself. That pleased him. Inside the room, the curtains were drawn though it was still light outside. He spoke about art and discipline, about how dancers understood control better than most people. When she talked about rejection, he reframed it as resilience. When she mentioned money, he brushed it aside, not with arrogance but with certainty. "I can help," he said, "but only if we're smart." Smart meant no names in public. Smart meant phones face down. Smart meant understanding that some worlds weren't meant to overlap. He didn't have to say what he was protecting. The weight of it filled the room. Mara listened. She absorbed his language, careful, necessary, temporary. He never asked directly for anything. He didn't need to. The imbalance hovered between them, unspoken but unmistakable. When he touched her hand, it wasn't hurried. It was measured, like a decision already justified. Afterward, as she dressed, she noticed how easily he returned to composure. Jacket on, watch adjusted, the man from the bar restored, as if nothing private had occurred. She felt suddenly aware of herself, of how exposed she was by comparison. "Does this change anything?" she asked. He considered the question. "Only if we let it." Outside, Mara walked faster than usual, the city blurring at the edges. She felt chosen and unsettled at once, desired, but on terms she hadn't written. Still, when her phone buzzed later with a single word, "Safe?" she answered immediately. Yes. Weeks passed. The pattern solidified. Private rooms. Careful timing. Conversations that never crossed certain lines. He spoke of responsibility, of risk, of how easily reputations were misunderstood. She began shaping herself around his expectations without realizing it. Canceling rehearsals, avoiding friends, memorizing his silences. Sometimes he brought gifts, cash folded too neatly. Tickets she never used, a pair of shoes he insisted were an investment. Each offering tightened the thread between them. "This stays between us," he reminded her once, his tone gentle but final. "For both our sakes." She nodded, even as a small part of her wondered when us had started meaning him. Late one night, lying awake in her apartment, Mara scrolled through her phone and realized she had saved his contact under a single letter. E. No last name. No context. A private shorthand for a life she couldn't describe to anyone else. Across the city, in a different kind of quiet room, Elliot Grayson reviewed a case file under soft lamplight. Names, dates, evidence. Order restored. He silenced his phone before entering the courthouse the next morning, sliding it into his jacket like a secret he had mastered. Neither of them noticed how close their worlds were drifting, how the careful separation he insisted upon was already thinning. And somewhere in the machinery of the justice system, records were being kept, logs maintained, details archived. Soon, something meant to stay private would surface where secrets were least protected. In open court under oath, where silence carried consequences, and every rule they thought they'd written could be rewritten by evidence that shouldn't have existed at all. The courtroom felt different that morning. Not louder, not tense in any obvious way, just alert, as if the walls themselves were listening more closely than usual. Judge Elliot Grayson took his seat behind the bench with the same controlled grace he always did, but his awareness was sharpened, every sound amplified. The shuffle of papers, the click of a pen, the faint cough from the gallery. He told himself it was nothing. The case before him was routine on the surface, a federal corruption trial involving a development company accused of bribery and influence peddling. He had reviewed the filings late into the night, silencing his phone twice when it vibrated. He had not read the messages. He didn't need to. He already knew what they would say. Proceedings began smoothly. Opening statements. Familiar legal language. Grayson listened, nodded, intervened when necessary. He was doing what he had done thousands of times before. Then the defense attorney stood. "Your Honor," the man said, clearing his throat. "Before we continue, the defense wishes to introduce supplemental material relevant to witness credibility." Grayson's pen paused mid-note. "Proceed," he said evenly. The attorney approached the bench with a folder thinner than expected, not evidence-heavy. Precise. Intentional. He didn't hand it over immediately. Instead, he spoke. "The witness scheduled for later this week, Mara Vale, dancer, independent contractor, has connections that raise serious ethical concerns regarding this court." The name hit Grayson like a misstep in the dark. He kept his face still. Years on the bench had trained him well, but something tightened behind his eyes, a subtle pressure that no one else could feel. "Explain," Grayson said. The attorney nodded and finally placed a folder on the bench. Inside were printed phone logs, neatly tabbed. Dates, times, frequency highlighted in yellow. Ms. Vale has been in repeated private contact with an individual using a restricted number register to. The attorney stopped, just long enough for the silence to sharpen. "Judge Elliot Grayson." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quiet but alive. Grayson felt the room shift like a collective breath being held. He scanned the documents, his expression unchanged, though his pulse thudded loudly in his ears. The calls were real, the timestamps undeniable. What unsettled him wasn't that they existed. It was that they were here. How were these obtained, he asked. Subpoenaed records, the attorney replied. Legally acquired. Grayson closed the folder slowly. The law was precise like that. Impersonal. Indifferent to intention. This court will take a brief recess, he said, voice steady. The gavel struck before anyone could say more. In his chambers, the quiet collapsed around him. He stood by the window, hands braced against the sill, watching people move below. Unaware, unbothered, he replayed every decision, every message left undelete. He had been careful. He had set rules. Apparently, not careful enough. His phone buzzed. Mara, something's wrong. I just got a call from an attorney. He didn't respond. Back in the courtroom, whispers had already begun. Journalists typed faster than usual. A clerk avoided eye contact. No one accused him outright. Not yet, but the idea had been planted. And in a place governed by precedent, ideas mattered. Grayson returned to the bench and resumed proceedings as if nothing had happened. But the courtroom no longer felt obedient. It felt curious. Somewhere across the city, Mara sat on the edge of her bed, phone clutched in both hands, realizing that the private world she had been told was invisible had just stepped into the light. And once something entered the record, it didn't disappear. It waited for testimony, for context, for voices that could no longer afford to stay silent. The whispers began before anyone spoke them out loud. They moved through hallways and inboxes, through glances that lingered a second too long, and conversations that stopped when someone entered the room. By the end of the week, the story no longer needed names, just implication, a judge, a witness, a line crossed. Mara felt it first in the silence. Her phone, once alive with messages from E, went still. When it did buzz, it wasn't him. It was an unfamiliar number, a calm professional voice asking for her time. An attorney, then another. Each call tightened the knot in her chest. She replayed the defense attorney's words in her head. Ethical concerns. She hadn't thought of herself as evidence. She had been a secret, carefully folded away. Evidence belonged to other people. At night, she lay awake, listening to the building settle, her thoughts spiraling. She remembered how often he'd said, "This stays between us." How confident he'd sounded. How safe that confidence had made her feel. Now it felt like a trap. Across the city, Elliot Grayson read the morning paper, without seeing the words. His name hadn't appeared. Not yet. But the article danced around it, describing an unprecedented ethical inquiry involving a federal judge. He folded the paper precisely and set it aside. He had spent his life understanding the law's appetite. Once fed, it never stopped. He called Mara that evening. His voice, when she answered, was familiar, controlled, steady, but the warmth was gone. "You shouldn't speak to anyone without counsel," he said. "Not are you okay? Not I'm sorry. Just instructions." "They already know," she said quietly. "About us?" A pause. Calculated. "What they know and what they can prove are very different things," he replied. "This will pass if you're careful." Careful. The word landed differently now. He explained the narrative they needed. Mentorship misinterpreted. Contact taken out of context. No intimacy. No dependency. Just coincidence and assumption. He spoke as if assembling a case, not addressing a woman whose life was unraveling. "And the calls?" she asked. "The money?" "Support," he said. "Nothing illegal. Nothing improper." Mara stared at the wall as he spoke. She saw herself in the mirror of his language, reduced, reframed. Useful only as long as she fit the story. "What if I tell the truth?" she asked. This time, the silence stretched longer. "That would be a mistake," he said finally. His tone was still calm, but something sharper lived beneath it. "For both of us." When the call ended, Mara didn't cry. She sat very still, noticing how her hands trembled, not from fear alone, from clarity. The next morning, her name appeared in print. Not her face, not her story. Just a line, a civilian witness connected to the case. She was no longer invisible. She was exposed and alone. Reporters waited outside her building. Friends she hadn't spoken to in months texted vague concern. The studio manager left a voicemail, reminding her of unpaid rent, as if nothing else mattered. That afternoon, Mara opened her phone and scrolled through months of messages. She read them differently now. The pauses, the phrasing, the way his reassurance always carried conditions. She realized how often she'd been guided, nudged, corrected. She pressed record the next time he called. "I need you to trust me," his voice said through the speaker. "This only becomes dangerous if you make it so." Her thumb hovered, then steadied. "I trusted you," she replied. On the other end of the line, Elliot Grayson felt something shift, not panic, but irritation. He ended the call shortly after, reminding himself that control was never loud. It was subtle, persistent, but control depended on silence. And silence, Mara was beginning to understand, was no longer something she could afford. That night, she saved a recording in 3 places. She labeled it with the date, then another file, then another. Whispers had followed her into the open. Now they were forming words, sworn, recorded, waiting for a moment when they would no longer be hers to decide. And somewhere between fear and resolve, Mara made a choice that would carry her into the most dangerous role of her life. Not a dancer, not a secret, but a witness. Becoming a witness didn't feel brave. It felt like losing gravity. Mara moved through her days as if the ground beneath her had softened, unreliable. Every sound startled her. Every knock at the door made her heart stutter. She had imagined truth as something solid, a shield maybe, but instead it behaved like exposure. It stripped her down to the most fragile parts of herself and left her standing there, visible. She stopped dancing, not because she didn't want to, but because her body refused to obey. In the studio, the mirror showed her mistakes too clearly now. The hesitation, the imbalance. Movement required trust, and trust was the one thing she no longer possessed. Her attorney spoke in careful tones, explaining procedures, protections, possibilities. "You may be called. This could take months. There will be pressure." Mara nodded through it all, absorbing the words without fully understanding how they would change her life. Pressure arrived quickly. Elliot Grayson didn't call again, but his presence didn't disappear. It lingered in the form of indirect messages, a mutual contact asking if she was doing okay. Reminders slipped into conversation that reputations were fragile things. Nothing explicit, nothing provable, just enough to remind her who held the power and how easily it could be used without ever appearing to be used at all. At night, Mara replayed the recording she'd saved. Listening to his voice now felt different. Colder, more clinical. She heard the manipulation she had once mistaken for care, the way he framed her fear as inconvenience, her truth as risk. She wondered when she had stopped being a person to him. Sleep came in fragments. When it did, it carried memories she hadn't invited. Her first performance as a child, the applause she'd chased ever since, the quiet pride of being chosen. She woke with her jaw clenched, her body tight, as if bracing for impact. Across the city, Grayson watched his world narrow. Colleagues grew distant. Meetings were postponed. An internal review was mentioned, casually, but with intent. He told himself this was manageable, that systems favored stability, that men like him were not undone by one accusation, especially one tied to a woman with no standing. Still, something gnawed at him. He had always believed power was earned, a reflection of discipline and restraint. But now, he felt it slipping not violently but steadily, like sand through fingers. And beneath that sensation lived a deeper irritation. Mara was no longer predictable. He reviewed her statements with legal detachment, noting where emotion might be used against her. Trauma blurred memory. Stress caused inconsistency. He had taught these principles. Now he weaponized them in his mind. What unsettled him most wasn't the investigation. It was her refusal to disappear. Mara sensed a change in herself, too. One afternoon, while organizing files for her attorney, she paused over a message she hadn't noticed before, a casual dismissal of her concerns, sent months earlier. Reading it now, Something in her chest cracked open. Grief rushed in, sharp and unexpected. Not for him, but for the version of herself that had believed proximity to power meant protection. She closed her eyes and breathed through it. That was when the lesson settled. Not as a slogan, but as truth carved by experience. Power doesn't need to raise its voice to harm you. It only needs you to believe your silence is safer than your truth. She wrote it down, not for court, but for herself. The next call from the prosecutor was brief and direct. They wanted her testimony. Soon, official, on the record. Mara hung up and sat on the floor of her apartment, back against the couch, staring at nothing. Her hands shook, but beneath the fear lived something steadier, resolve, quiet but unyielding. She knew what testifying would cost her. Privacy, career, safety, whatever illusion of normal life she still had. But she also knew the cost of not doing it. That evening, she stepped into the studio for the first time in weeks. The lights hummed on. The floor felt unfamiliar under her feet. She didn't turn on music. She didn't rehearse choreography. She just moved, slowly, deliberately, reclaiming space inch by inch. Somewhere deep inside, a countdown had begun. Her testimony would force truths into the open, truths that couldn't be managed, reframed, or quietly dismissed. And for the first time since she'd met him, Mara understood that power, when threatened, rarely stayed passive. It reacted, which was why, as she left the studio and checked her phone, the message waiting for her made her stop cold. Unknown contact. We need to talk. Tonight. The cost of loving power had already been paid. What came next would demand far more. The message didn't ask. We need to talk. Tonight. Mara read it 3 times, her pulse steadying into something colder than fear. She didn't reply right away. She set the phone down on the studio floor and stood barefoot at center. The lights already on, the room empty and waiting. The wood was warm beneath her feet, scuffed by years of bodies chasing precision. This place had never judged her. It had only reflected what she brought into it. She inhaled and lifted her arms. No music, no mirror. She moved slowly at first, testing balance, letting weight settle into muscle and bone. Each step felt like a decision. Each turn, a refusal to rush. She danced the way she used when she was younger, when the goal wasn't applause, just honesty. The air carried her breath, the quiet catching every sound of skin against fabric. Images rose and fell as she moved. The bar's dim light, his measured smile, the first room with the curtains drawn. The way careful had sounded like kindness. She let the memories pass through her body and out again, leaving behind only motion. Halfway through, her phone buzzed on the floor. She ignored it. The dance became sharper then, angles cutting clean lines, feet striking with intent. This was rehearsal, but not for a performance. It was for standing still when it mattered, for saying what needed to be said, without shrinking, for remembering that she had a spine long before anyone else decided to lend her one. When she stopped, sweat cooled on her skin. She sat against the wall and wiped her face with her sleeve, heart thudding with a familiar, welcome ache. The studio clock read 9:17 p.m. She picked up her phone. Mara, where? The reply came quickly. An address, a place she recognized. Quiet, discreet, neutral. Not the hotel, not his apartment. Somewhere between. She packed up slowly, changed shoes, locked the studio with care, as if the ritual mattered more tonight. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent as ever. She walked a few blocks before hailing a ride, watching lights smear across the window like unfinished thoughts. In the back seat, she opened her notes app and typed a message she didn't send. Then another. Finally, she recorded a voice memo. Short, controlled. If anything feels wrong, she said softly, remember I tried to do this the right way. She saved it and shared it with one contact, just in case. The building at the address was unremarkable, the kind of place people forgot as soon as they left. The lobby smelled faintly of cleaner. A man at the desk nodded without curiosity. Mara took the elevator alone, her reflection wavering in the metal doors. When they opened, Elliot Grayson was already there. He looked the same, composed, tailored, untouched by the week's whispers. If anything, he looked relieved. "You shouldn't have come alone," he said, as if concern were still a shared language. "I'm not alone," she replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I brought myself." They sat. The space between them felt rehearsed, measured down to the inch. He spoke first, outlining consequences with the calm of a man explaining weather. Careers were fragile. Narratives could be corrected. Silence could still be mutually beneficial. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. Mara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she met his eyes. "I'm testifying," she said. "I won't lie anymore." For the first time, something flickered across his face. Annoyance, maybe, or the recognition that the rules had changed. "You don't understand what this will do," he said. "I do," she replied. "I just don't accept that it should stop me." She stood before he could respond. The conversation was over. Whatever power he had left couldn't reach her if she didn't stay to receive it. Outside, the night felt cooler. She checked her phone once, then slipped it into her bag and walked toward home, rehearsing nothing now, only carrying the quiet certainty that she had chosen truth over proximity. She didn't know this was the last time her body would feel light with purpose. She didn't know that the next morning would begin with questions no one wanted to ask. But somewhere in the city, the machinery of consequence had already begun to turn, slowly, inexorably, toward a door that would not open from the inside. Morning arrived without ceremony. The city woke the way it always did. Sirens in the distance, buses sighing at stops, sunlight finding its way through narrow gaps between buildings. In Mara's apartment, the light fell across the floor and stopped there, as if unsure how to proceed. She didn't answer her phone. At first, it didn't alarm anyone. Mara was known for disappearing into herself, for late nights and late mornings. A missed call was not unusual. 2 went unnoticed. By the 3rd, the concern shifted, subtle but present. By noon, it hardened. A neighbor complained about music that had played too long into the night and then stopped abruptly. The building manager knocked once, then again, keys heavy in his hand. When the door finally opened, it did so with the reluctance of something disturbed too late. Mara lay on the living room floor. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture. Her body rested at an angle that suggested she had been moving and simply hadn't finished. One arm curved toward her chest, the other extended as if reaching for balance. Her phone was a few feet away, face down. The room smelled faintly of cleaner and sweat, ordinary and wrong at the same time. Paramedics moved with quiet efficiency. Police followed. Questions were asked in low voices. The word accident floated briefly, lightly, before sinking under its own weight. Across the city, Elliot Grayson stood at his kitchen counter, tie half nodded, listening to a voicemail he didn't remember asking for. The message was short, professional, unemotional. "There's been an incident involving Ms. Vale." He didn't sit down. He didn't interrupt. When the call ended, he remained where he was, hands braced against the marble, breathing measuredly. For a moment, just one, his reflection in the darkened window looked unfamiliar. He told himself what he had told himself all week: stay composed. Let the process work. Tragedy invited speculation, and speculation was manageable. By the time the news broke, the language had softened the edges. A woman found deceased. No immediate signs of foul play. Investigation ongoing. Grayson recused himself from the case that afternoon. The announcement was brief, framed as precaution. No emotion attached. Cameras caught him exiting the courthouse. Expression solemn, appropriate. He did not stop to speak. Inside the building where Mara lived, a detective stood quietly, scanning the room again. He noticed a careful order, the way things were put away with intention. He noticed the phone, the charger still plugged in, the bag by the door. He noticed what wasn't there: a note, a struggle, an obvious explanation. "People usually leave something," he murmured to his partner, "even if it's just a mess." In the days that followed, the story grew louder. Her name appeared everywhere, often without her face. When it did appear, it was framed by speculation, aspiring dancer, connected to court inquiry. She became context, then controversy. The nuance of her life flattened into headlines. Flowers appeared outside her building, then disappeared just as quickly. A short vigil formed and dissolved. Grief moved through strangers briefly before finding something else to attach itself to. Grayson watched the coverage at night, volume low. He noted what wasn't said as carefully as what was. No accusations, no proof, just questions hanging in the air, unanswered but insistent. He slept poorly. In a small evidence room, a technician cataloged Mara's belongings. Phone, laptop, a notebook with half-written thoughts. Audio files labeled with dates. Carefully backed up, intentionally preserved. The detective returned, slower this time. He listened. He frowned. "This isn't nothing," he said quietly. "A body could end a story, or it could begin one." By the end of the week, the narrative shifted, not dramatically, but enough to matter. Words like review and interest replaced accident. The recordings were logged. Financial records flagged. Patterns began to emerge. Faint but undeniable. Mara had not left a confession. She had left something more dangerous. And as the investigation widened, it became clear that her silence in death was already speaking, pulling at threads that led back to private rooms, public power, and a truth that would not stay buried simply because its witness was gone. The recordings changed the temperature of the room. They were played quietly at first, through tinny speakers in a windowless office where no one raised their voice. Dates were verified, metadata confirmed. The words themselves did the work. Measured, calm, unmistakably familiar to anyone who had ever listened to a judge speak with authority. "This will pass if you're careful." That would be a mistake. For both of us. The detective leaned back, folding his arms. He had seen grief masquerade as coincidence before. He had seen power try to pass as inevitability. What he hadn't seen, not often, was evidence this intentional. "Who taught her to do this?" someone asked. "No one," he replied. "She taught herself." The investigation widened without fanfare. No dramatic press conference. Just requests, bank records, travel logs, security footage. The kind of work that looked like paperwork until it didn't. Patterns surfaced slowly, like bones under receding water. Payments labeled support. Hotel bookings made by assistants who never asked questions. Phone calls routed through numbers designed to disappear. None of it illegal on its face. All of it telling a story when placed side by side. Mara's life began to reassemble itself in fragments. Text to friends she'd stopped seeing, notes about rehearsals she'd missed, voice memos she recorded when she couldn't sleep. Not a woman spiraling, but a woman organizing, preparing. Across the city, Elliot Grayson felt the shift before it reached him. He noticed it in the tone of emails, shorter, less deferential. In meetings postponed indefinitely. In the way a colleague didn't return his greeting in the hallway. He told himself this was how institutions protected themselves, by creating distance before signing blame. At night, he reviewed his own history the way he taught others to, searching for inconsistencies, for places where intent might be misread. He reminded himself that no one had accused him of murder, that tragedy did not imply guilt, that the law demanded proof. Still, he avoided mirrors. The media found new angles. Not accusations, questions. Ethics experts speculated. Former clerks declined to comment. Each segment added weight, without ever naming the thing it pressed against. Mara's name appeared again, this time paired with the word witness. At the precinct, the detective listened to the recordings a second time, then a third. He paid attention not just to what Grayson said, but to how Mara responded. The pauses, the careful phrasing, the way she seemed to measure every word as if anticipating consequence. "She knew," he said quietly. "She knew exactly what would happen if she spoke." The prosecutor agreed. "Which means her death isn't the end of this. It's the hinge." They mapped the timeline on a whiteboard. The last rehearsal, the message asking to meet, the neutral location, the walk home, the absence of forced entry, the lack of a note, too clean to ignore, too quiet to dismiss. No single piece proved anything. Together, they refused to be buried. Grayson received the notice on a Tuesday morning, an invitation framed as a requirement. He read it twice, then placed it carefully on his desk, aligning the edges. His hands did not shake. He called his attorney. "They're overreaching," he said. "This is grief dressed up as scrutiny." "Then treat it that way," the attorney replied. "Answer only what you must. Admit nothing you don't have to." Grayson nodded, though no one could see him. He had spent his life on the right side of that advice. In a small apartment that no longer belonged to anyone, boxes were stacked and labeled. Mara's things prepared for storage. A friend sorted through costumes and notebooks, stopping now and then to read a line, to remember a laugh. At the bottom of a bag, she found a folded page. Not a note, just a sentence, written in careful script. "If this ends badly, tell them I try to tell the truth." The friend pressed it to her chest, then handed it to the detective. By the end of the week, the story had shifted again. Not dramatically. Not yet. But enough that people stopped asking what happened to her and started asking who was she trying to speak against. Grayson watched the news in silence. He noted the careful language, the absence of conclusions. He told himself this was survivable, that reputations could be damaged and still endure, that the law did not convict on implication. But late that night, alone in his chambers, he opened a file he hadn't touched in years, his own notes on judicial ethics. He read passages he had once quoted with conviction. Distance, impartiality, the appearance of fairness. For the first time, the words felt less like principles and more like witnesses. Truth didn't stay buried because it didn't belong to the dead alone. It lodged itself in records, in patterns, in the quiet determination of people who kept looking when it would have been easier to stop. The call came the next morning. They wanted him under oath. And for the first time since the whispers began, Elliot Grayson understood that the courtroom he had ruled for decades was about to turn attention fully toward him, where the gavel did not offer shelter, and every answer carried a cost he could no longer calculate. The courtroom did not rise when Elliot Grayson entered. It wasn't a rule violation. It wasn't disrespect. It was procedure. He was not presiding today. He was appearing. The realization settled into his body with unexpected weight. The bench stood empty, elevated and indifferent, the gavel resting where his hand used to fall without thought. Grayson took his seat at the witness table instead, the chair lower than he remembered any courtroom chair ever being. Under oath, the room felt closer, the air heavier. He answered preliminary questions easily. Name, position, years of service. His voice was steady, measured, familiar to everyone present. It sounded like authority even now, though the source of it had shifted. Then came the questions that mattered. "Yes," he said, "I knew Ms. Vale." "Yes," he admitted, "we communicated outside of official channels." "No," he insisted, "there was no coercion, no explicit exchange, no intent to influence testimony. The relationship," he said, "had been misunderstood. Private, yes. Improper in appearance, perhaps, but not illegal." He chose his words the way he always had. Precisely, strategically, each sentence built a fence around the truth rather than revealing it. He framed himself as a man who had made a personal error, not a professional one. A lapse, not a pattern. The prosecutor listened without interrupting. When the recordings were introduced, Grayson did not look at the screen. He stared straight ahead as his own voice filled the courtroom. Calm, directive, unmistakable. This only becomes dangerous if you make it so. The words echoed differently here. Stripped of context, stripped of control. Grayson swallowed once. He adjusted his cuff. "Is that your voice?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes." "Was Ms. Vale under investigation at the time?" "No, but she was a potential witness in a case over which you presided." "Yes." "And you advised her not to speak." "I advised caution." The prosecutor paused, letting the distinction hang in the air. "Judge Grayson," she said evenly, "do you believe a woman in Ms. Vale's position, financially unstable, emotionally invested, significantly younger, had equal power in that relationship?" Grayson opened his mouth, then closed it. "I believe," he said carefully, "that adults are responsible for their choices." The answer landed with a dull thud. Not wrong enough to object to. Not right enough to ignore. From the gallery, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence was no longer obedient. It was evaluative. By the end of the testimony, nothing definitive had been proven, no confession extracted, no crime named. But something else had happened, something less visible and more lasting. The image of Elliot Grayson as untouchable had fractured. That afternoon, he submitted his resignation. The statement was brief, voluntary, for the good of the institution. Words chosen preserve dignity where possible. The announcement rippled outward, news alerts, expert panels, opinion pieces dissecting ethics and appearance and the burden of power. Grayson returned home alone. Without the robe, without the bench, his apartment felt unfamiliar. The walls were too quiet, the shelves too orderly. He poured a drink and didn't finish it. He sat in a chair and realized he had nowhere he needed to be. For the first time in decades, no one was waiting for his decision. Across the city, Mara's name was spoken again in rooms where she could no longer hear it. Advocates debated. Commentators argued. Some called her brave. Others called her reckless. Few called her what she was. Human. The investigation closed without a murder charge. Cause of death remained officially undetermined. No clear evidence. No witness to the final hours. The law demanded certainty it could not obtain. Grayson read the notice without visible reaction. He told himself this was the end, that consequences had been paid, that absence of conviction meant resolution. But late that night, unable to sleep, he opened a folder on his computer. Files he had not deleted, recordings he had never erased. He listened again, this time not as a judge, not as a defendant, but as a man stripped of title. He heard what he had once dismissed. Fear disguised as compliance. Trust reshaped into obligation. Somewhere between the words, he felt it, the weight of something no court had ruled on. In another part of the city, a small memorial was being planned quietly. No cameras, no statements, just people who had known Mara as more than a headline. The law had finished its work. What remained was reckoning, private, unresolved, and far less merciful. And in the silence that followed the verdicts that never came, one truth lingered, waiting to be understood in a world that preferred conclusions to consequences. Silence arrived slowly, then all at once. After the resignation, after the headlines thinned and the panels moved on, the city returned to its usual rhythm. New cases replaced old outrage. Names were forgotten. What remained was quieter, less visible, but heavier. Mara's memorial was held on a gray afternoon in a studio much like the one she had rehearsed in. No programs were printed. No speeches were prepared. People stood where they could, some along the walls, others sitting on the floor. A pair of her shoes rested at center stage, worn thin at the toes. They played music she had loved, not dramatic, not mournful, just steady, honest. Those who spoke did so briefly. A former classmate remembered how Mara stayed late to help others rehearse. A neighbor talked about hearing music through the walls, how it sounded like someone insisting on hope. No one mentioned the case by name. No one said his name at all. Outside, the city didn't pause. Inside, time loosened its grip. Elliot Grayson did not attend. He followed the coverage from a distance, then stopped altogether. The news no longer needed him. His resignation had become a footnote, an ethics lesson summarized in paragraph. He spent his days walking without destination, sitting in cafes where no one recognized him, learning the shape of anonymity. At night, the silence pressed harder. He thought often about control, how effortlessly it had once come to him, how invisible it had felt. He replayed conversations, not to justify them anymore, but to understand when certainty had replaced care. He wondered how many times he had mistaken being listened to for being right. There were no legal consequences left to fear. That, he discovered, was the cruelest part. Mara's apartment emptied quickly. Her belongings were boxed and stored. Her lease quietly terminated. What couldn't be packed were the echoes, the sense that something unfinished lingered in the room she had occupied. Her recordings were archived, her name entered into reports, her story cited in trainings and panels and debates about power and ethics. She became an example, useful, instructive, distant. But to those who had known her, she remained stubbornly present, Weeks later, a small dance piece premiered in a local showcase. No announcement connected it to her. No dedication appeared in the program. But those who watched felt it. The restraint, the pauses, the way the final movement ended not with flourish, but with stillness. The audience didn't applaud right away. Silence held. That was the thing Mara had left behind. Not accusation, not resolution, but a space that refused to be filled too easily. A reminder that truth did not always arrive with verdicts, and justice did not always look like punishment. Sometimes it looked like discomfort that lingered. Grayson felt it one evening as he stood alone in his apartment, staring at the place on the wall where a framed certificate had once hung. He had taken it down without ceremony. The nail remained. For the first time, he understood that losing power was not the same as losing responsibility. Across the city, a young dancer practiced late, replaying a recording she found online. Mara's voice, calm but resolute, speaking about fear and truth. She didn't know Mara, had never met her, but something in the words stayed with her, shaping how she moved, how she spoke, how she chose when to stay silent and when not to. The case had closed, but the cost of it hadn't. In the end, there was no final revelation, no sentence that neatly explained what had been taken or what had been learned. Only the quiet understanding that some stories don't end when the law stops speaking. They end when people decide what to carry forward. And in the silence she left behind, something endured, not loud enough to headline, not sharp enough to convict, but strong enough to unsettle those who would rather forget, which perhaps was the truest verdict of all.